My name is Eli. I'm 8. They said I could go home if I stopped crying. In the early spring of 1812, an entire classroom of children vanished from a boarding school tucked deep in the forests of Illinois. No bodies were found, no footprints, no signs of escape. The school claimed a cholera outbreak. The town believed it, but decades later, a cache of human teeth was unearthed beneath the schoolhouse floorboards, each one filed to a razor point. What follows is a descent, not just into madness, but into something far more ancient, something that took root in American soil long before the country had a name. This is the story of the Ashcroft School for Industrious Youth and the family that ran it like a slaughterhouse. In the fall of 1808, 3 covered wagons rolled into the outskirts of Wilmer's Hollow, Illinois, a town so young it had no church bells and no burial ground. The Ashcrofts were tall, pale, reserved folk with black clothing and British accents that felt a few decades too late. They brought with them heavy trunks, a half-dozen silent children, and blueprints for what they called a new form of learning. Within 6 months, the Ashcroft School for Industrious Youth was built, stone-walled, spire-roofed, with thick iron locks on the inside of every door. The townspeople called it a miracle of progress. They offered up their orphans, widows' sons, and even their own children, eager for them to be taught by learned men from across the ocean. But what no one knew then was that the Ashcrofts weren't educators. They were descendants of an obscure religious order exiled from England in the 1600s, driven out not for heresy, but for crimes too grotesque to speak aloud. The school promised order, faith, and discipline. It delivered none. Instead, by winter's end, local animals had gone missing. Children began talking in their sleep. One mother found her daughter standing in the middle of a frozen pond, barefoot, eyes wide, whispering the Lord's Prayer backward. And still, no one asked questions. The Ashcroft School did not teach arithmetic or reading, at least not in any recognizable form. Children were woken at 4:44 a.m. each day by a bell made from bone and copper, its ringing low and unnatural. Mornings were spent in silence, copying strange symbols into thin black books with ink that smelled like iron and vinegar. There were no recesses, no laughter, no windows that opened. The oldest Ashcroft, a man known only as Father Edric, enforced the rules with a cane carved from twisted wood, its handle bearing the face of a blind lamb. He insisted that obedience was the foundation of salvation, and that every bruise was a lesson etched into the soul. Children were forbidden to speak to each other after sunset. Those who did were taken below the main hall, for what the staff called reconditioning. They returned pale, slower, dull-eyed. One boy, Samuel Whitlock, came back with a missing thumb and no memory of who his parents were. The Ashcrofts recorded everything in a red leather ledger kept behind a locked cabinet. Entries were written in Latin, but occasionally phrases in English bled through. Subject 14 broke again. Will not stop dreaming of the well. Remove the tongue. Fear must enter silence. No inspectors ever came. No one dared challenge the school. The town had become dependent on it. Parents worked for the Ashcrofts. Churches took their donations. The mayor's own son had been enrolled, and in every painting on the wall the eyes seemed just slightly wrong. There was one place no child spoke of, even in whispers, the chamber beneath the east wing. Hidden behind a false panel in the floor, it was called the well. Some said it was bottomless, others said it was alive. Only the worst-behaved children were sent there, and none came back the same. Their mouths became too wide for their faces. Their fingernails grew long and translucent, as if the body no longer knew how to be human. They'd scream at the sound of running water, shiver in daylight. One girl, little Annabeth Keller, once whispered to a younger child in the dormitory, "It calls you by your real name down there, the one God forgot." She was found the next morning, her body folded neatly into her own suitcase, eyes sewn shut with black thread. Father Edric claimed it was suicide. He spoke at her funeral, quoting scripture that didn't exist. The child who is broken shall serve beyond the veil. The child who obeys shall never descend. That winter an unmarked grave was dug behind the school, and the children were reminded, obedience prevents the fall. But the ground around the school was changing. Dogs would not enter it. Trees grew gnarled and leafless. Snow melted in patterns that resembled teeth. Whatever was under that building, it was waking. By the spring of 1810, the children at Ashcroft had stopped drawing flowers, trees, and homes. Instead, they filled their notebooks with spirals, mouths within mouths, limbs tied into loops, crosses inverted into keys. A local seamstress, Mrs. Clara Vintner, had volunteered to teach needlework to the older girls once a week. One afternoon, while sorting through embroidery patterns, she discovered that every child's sampler bore the same symbol, a triangle within a circle, stitched in red. When she asked about it, one girl, Miriam, aged 9, screamed uncontrollably until she collapsed. That same night, Clara packed her belongings and left Wilmer's Hollow. Her husband said she never spoke again. She died 2 years later in an asylum in Kentucky. The only phrase she repeated in her final days was, "They learn it with their skin." Meanwhile, the townspeople noticed something else. Each time a new family sent a child to Ashcroft, they stopped attending church. Some sold their livestock. Others boarded up windows, claiming the wind carried voices at night. It wasn't just the children who were being changed. It was the town itself. The Ashcrofts were not blood relatives. At least, not in the way we understand family. There were 12 of them, 6 men, 5 women, and one figure no one could quite name. It moved like a man but wore a black veil that covered its entire face, even while teaching. They called it Mother Bell. No one ever saw them eat. They spoke in unison during prayer. They did not age. A traveling tinker once described them in his journal. They breathed at the same time, I swear it, like a bellows, as if they were all attached to the same lung. Each week, they held a private gathering in the bell tower. The sound that came down from it wasn't music. It was a thudding rhythm, wet, organic, and off-tempo. The townspeople said it felt like something knocking from the inside of their skulls. And still, the town did nothing. Fear had turned to ritual. The people believed what they were told. The Ashcrofts were godly, wise, chosen. Any doubts were buried beneath politeness, propriety, and the growing list of children who simply ran away. By now, that list had reached 37 names. In July of 1811, a boy named Elias Marr escaped the school. He was found 8 miles outside of town, hiding beneath a collapsed barn, naked and speaking a language no one could place. His eyes had been scorched by sunlight. He hadn't seen the sky in months. At first, he could not be touched. He shrieked at the sound of bells and begged to be taken underground, back to the cold where it's quiet. But over time, Elias began to remember. And when he did, he told the town's doctor things that should have never been known. He described tunnels beneath the school, carved in spirals, chambers with symbols etched into the walls using child-sized teeth, a hall of mirrors where the reflections did not match the faces, a room filled with cages, and worse, he remembered being placed on a stone table, surrounded by the Ashcrofts. He remembered Father Edric whispering, "You must forget what came before, Elias. Your body is only borrowed now. Your soul is being prepared." The doctor wrote it all down, but the day before he planned to ride to Chicago and alert the authorities, his home burned to the ground. His family perished. Elias was never seen again. The official story was simple. Elias never escaped. He died of fever. There was no barn, no journal, no warning, only smoke. By the end of 1811, Wilmer's Hollow was silent. No children played in the streets. Shops stayed shuttered past midday. Church services stopped altogether. Even the birds had vanished. The school remained fully operational, now housing more than 60 children, and no one, not even grieving mothers, asked to see them. The Ashcrofts had become something else. Their presence was no longer questioned. It was obeyed, as one obeys the moon or the tide. Farmers salted their fields in patterns passed down in whispers. Women bled into white bowls on the new moon. All of it, to appease whatever was being fed below that building. Some said it was a pact. Others said it was fear, but perhaps it was simply resignation, the kind of horror that becomes ordinary over time, the kind that teaches people to close their eyes when the ground begins to breathe. No one left. No one spoke out. But on December 31st, 1811, something changed. A sound erupted from beneath the school, a low, mournful groan that lasted nearly 7 full minutes. Every child in town began to cry, and the snow outside the Ashcroft School turned the color of milk. By January of 1812, Father Edric began circulating a manuscript to the older students, a black book without a title, bound in what the apothecary later swore was human leather. Inside were prayers, but not in any recognizable faith. They weren't in Latin, they weren't in English. They were phonetic instructions, chants that throbbed when read aloud. Each student was forced to memorize these verses by candlelight. Those who failed were taken to the bell tower and returned shaking, unable to speak above a whisper. One phrase kept returning in the children's speech, scratched into walls and murmured in their sleep, "I see the true shape of the world. It is not a circle, it is a mouth." The hollow gospel, because that's what the townsfolk began calling it, preached a reversal of creation, that God had not made man, but emptied man. That true knowledge lay in forgetting what light looks like. A local pastor, Reverend Amos Krill, tried to burn the manuscript after discovering one in a pupil's desk. His hands were found 2 miles apart.
the gospel reappeared in its original drawer. No matter how many copies were destroyed, the number always stayed at 12. The school's layout had changed. Hallways no longer led where they once had. Doors that opened yesterday were now bricked over. The basement stretched too far. A carpenter measuring the crawl space beneath the dining hall found it continued for 47 feet, despite the building itself only spanning 32. Inside that space, crude carvings, scratches made by small hands, and bones that had grown together in unnatural ways, children's skulls with extra rows of teeth, ribs bent backward, a femur carved with scripture. A journal entry from one of the groundskeepers, Mr. Darrell Pope, was found decades later in a barn loft sealed with soot. The school is changing shape when no one looks, like it's remembering how to become something older. The spiral motif was everywhere now, on ceilings, stitched into bedding, carved into desks. It wasn't a design, it was a path, and it always led down. The harvest table was used for awakenings. No one outside the Ashcroft circle knew what the rituals involved, but a firelight glimpse through an open shutter one autumn night gave a local gravedigger cause to flee the town forever. He told a barkeep weeks later, "They're not killing the children, they're opening them." The table itself was stone, older than the school, older than the town. Drag marks suggest it was hauled from a previous settlement known only in oral folklore as Barrow's Mercy, a failed Quaker commune that disappeared around Children were taken to the harvest table one by one, always at night, always after weeks of starvation and isolation. A bell would toll just before the ritual, one loud sickening note that caused birds to fall dead from the sky. No child ever returned the same, most never returned at all. But the few who did, they began speaking in unison. By the third week of January, 12 students had been chosen. They wore grey smocks, their hair had been shaved, they no longer responded to their birth names, they sat perfectly still during meals, they blinked at exact intervals, they answered questions in a single synchronized tone. The Ashcrofts called them the choir. They led morning chants, they marched barefoot through the snow without pain. One of them, a boy named Jonah Brooks, stood for an hour in front of the hearth and whispered something that made the fire burn black. When a town elder tried to remove his granddaughter from the school by force, the 12 students turned to him and spoke. "She has been marked. She is part of the offering. You cannot take what has already been given." That man was later found in the woods, strung between two trees, his body hollowed, but untouched by animals. The choir grew stronger, and behind their eyes, something watched. Nobody knew where the Ashcrofts were truly from. They claimed England, but spoke no known dialect. Their names did not appear in shipping logs, immigration papers, or property deeds, and yet they owned the land. According to a fragmented letter from Judge Otis Bellwether, who tried to challenge the Ashcrofts' claim in I do not mean dead, I mean stricken, like it never was. A gap in the ink, a name burned out of the page. The judge's letter ends mid-sentence. He was found days later, arms folded across his chest, mouth full of soil, eyes replaced with black stones. Some believe the Ashcrofts came from a splinter sect of the Cluniac order, an ultra-ascetic monastic cult known for child sacrifice, erased from church records in the early 60s. Others say they were never human, that they were avatars of something that had lived beneath the earth long before men walked on it. Whatever their origin, the Ashcrofts did not die. No graves, no sickness, no aging, only the unrelenting pursuit of silence, order, and obedience, and beneath their feet, a mouth, waiting to open. On the final Sunday of January 1812, the townspeople were called to a gathering at the school chapel. No explanation was given, no one refused. Inside the chapel, candles lined the walls, and the walls themselves breathed, a soft pulsing, as though the stone had gone soft and vascular. The choir stood at the altar, behind them, a painting of the crucifixion, except Christ had no face, only a spiral, arms outstretched, not nailed, but welcoming. The Ashcrofts entered last, and as they began to chant, something happened. The townspeople could not move, not scream, not weep. Their bodies had been trained to obey. Children emerged from side doors, covered in ash, singing. The sound wasn't music, it was reversal, like hymns sung backward through a throat full of teeth. One survivor, a housemaid named Josie Pike, hid beneath a pew. She later wrote, "The sermon was not for us, it was for something underneath us, and it heard." Josie vanished the day after she testified. Her tongue was mailed to the sheriff's office. After the last Sunday, Wilmer's Hollow began to disappear, not metaphorically, literally. Clocks no longer advanced, shadows froze in place. A candle could burn for 3 days without melting. Some residents began repeating entire days, speaking the same phrases, bleeding from the nose, unable to recall sleep. One blacksmith struck iron for 7 hours straight, unaware his hands were melting. It was as though time had become looped, like a damaged reel. The school was the epicenter. Its bell rang at irregular intervals, once at 3:17 a.m., again at 3:17 a.m., and again somehow before that. The Ashcrofts said it was the undoing of the lie. That time itself had been a shackle placed on humanity by false gods. They were returning the world to its original form, an earlier form, one with no mercy, no sequence, only hunger. On February 2nd, the choir vanished, not in the way of children slipping into the woods. This was different. Witnesses described a light, deep red, almost black, that filled the school windows like blood spilling across canvas. 12 voices sang in unison, not from mouths but from the walls, the soil, the water. One man, a constable named Wirt Dunley, broke into the school with a lantern and shotgun. What he found was not a building. He found a chasm, spiraling down forever, and at its center, a stone altar, slick with something that steamed in cold air. The choir stood on its edge, heads tilted skyward, mouths wide, dislocating wider than human anatomy should allow. Then they fell, all 12, not screaming, singing. The sound that followed drove Wirt blind. He clawed his own eyes out with his belt buckle and screamed, "They're inside the blood," for 6 hours before dying of shock. The town sealed its doors. The school was locked, and the spiral kept turning. On the night of February 9th, 1812, a storm swept across central Illinois. Black wind, no lightning, no rain, just pressure, something pulling. At midnight, the Ashcroft bell rang once, then never again. Residents of neighboring towns saw something rise from Wilmer's hollow. Not a building, not fire, something vertical, too tall to measure, hollow in the center. It bent the trees, it cracked the frozen soil, and then nothing. When sunrise came, the school was gone. No rubble, no foundation, not even scorch marks. The land where it stood had been flattened like the palm of a giant hand, pressed down and lifted again. Wilmer's hollow had no people, every house abandoned. Bread left in ovens, water frozen in basins, candles half melted, toys in the snow. The town had been removed. Witnesses say they could hear faint singing, echoing from beneath the dirt. This is the offering, this is the forgetting, and then the ground sealed itself. In 1813, government officials arrived in the region under the banner of territorial reclamation, but they did not attempt to resettle. They built a perimeter, burned records, bribed cartographers to leave the area unmarked. Wilmer's hollow was erased from maps. The Ashcroft name was listed in classified ledgers as potential vector anomaly, cultural. A strange turn of phrase, used only 3 other times in U.S. history, all redacted. One surviving letter from a surveyor named Branson Hume made it to his sister in Ohio. It read, "They're burying it, not just the town, the memory, the shape of it. They say it's for national security. But I saw the spiral. I heard the Hume beneath the dirt. We aren't sealing something away, we're sealing it in." He was executed for treason 5 days later. In 1923, over a century later, a group of amateur historians found what they believed was the edge of Wilmer's hollow. Nothing but weeds and dust. But one of them, a man named Albert Prue, tripped on something buried just beneath the topsoil. It was a child's shoe. Inside it, curled and blackened, a human toe bone. They found more over the next 2 days. Bits of cloth, fingernails, a child's notebook half-eaten by mold. The only legible words, "The lamb comes last. The lamb watches." The third night, Albert woke to find his tent filled with a humming sound, like a chorus underwater. He wandered into the brush. They never found his body, only his teeth, arranged in a perfect spiral. You've never heard of Wilmer's hollow. You've never read about the Ashcrofts. There are no photographs, no census data, no plaques, because this is a history that was not buried. It was consumed. But some things cannot be killed. Not by fire, not by silence. They survive in pattern, in architecture, in blood. A spiral is not a symbol. It is a path, one that pulls you inward, over and over, until you forget what beginning meant. And somewhere, beneath layers of soil and concrete, a school still stands, a door still locked from the inside, a bell rusted with blood, waiting. The obedience prevents the fall. The child who obeys shall never descend. And if you ever hear singing in the dark, stop walking, because it isn't a song, it's a calling, and your name is already in the book.